For 10 years, he delivered mail to his own daughter's doorstep, knowing she'd open every envelope but never the truth about who he really was. In the quiet town of Harmony Springs, Kentucky, where the mail still comes with a human touch and the mornings smell faintly of pine and bread, a man named Thomas Whitaker has walked the same route every day for nearly a decade. Tall, stooped, and wrapped always in the same navy coat regardless of the season, Thomas is the kind of man no one really notices until they do. He delivers letters with silent precision, never speaking unless spoken to, and always lingers just a second longer at the White House on Willow Lane with the giant oak tree shading its porch. To most, he's simply the mailman, reliable, forgettable. But to 10-year-old Sophie Lane, he's a mystery, wrapped in navy wool, the only person who stares at their mailbox like it holds a memory. She doesn't know his name. She doesn't know he once loved a woman who lived in that very house. She doesn't know he's her grandfather, and she doesn't yet understand that some men carry their regrets in canvas bags, delivering the same apology every day without ever daring to knock. Harmony Springs. Kentucky wasn't the kind of town people came to looking for stories. It was a town where time felt like it moved a few beats slower, where the grocery store still bagged with paper, and where front porches mattered more than front pages. Nestled between quiet hills and narrow two-lane roads, it was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, or thought they did. On Maple Street, just past the old bakery that smelled of cinnamon and history, stood a white house with a fading red mailbox. The house looked like any other except to the man who stopped in front of it every morning at exactly 9:15 a.m., rain or shine. His name was Thomas Whitaker, and to most people, he was just the mailman. He wore a worn navy jacket even in July and kept his eyes low, never engaging in the small-town chatter that so often lingered in the air. He walked with a quiet rhythm, each step measured as if he were carrying more than just mail in his bag. What no one knew, not the florist, not the pastor, not even the curious kids who watched him from their bikes, was that the house on Maple Street belonged to his daughter, Emma, a woman he hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades. She lived there with her own daughter, now Sophie, a wide-eyed girl with a notebook always tucked under her arm. Neither of them knew the truth. Every day, Thomas placed envelopes into the mailbox, some real, some ones he'd written himself, unsigned, filled with small, kind messages disguised as anonymous neighbors. It was the only way he knew how to speak to her. He never dared walk up the steps, never knocked. He simply lingered a heartbeat longer than usual, then turned and moved on. And in that heartbeat, between the creak of the mailbox lid and the crunch of his retreating footsteps, was all the fatherhood he believed he had left. Thomas Whitaker had mastered the art of vanishing in plain sight. He moved through the town like a shadow, always present, never noticed. He lived alone in a weathered cabin on the edge of Harmony Springs, tucked behind a line of evergreens that whispered in the wind and kept secrets as well as he did. Every morning he rose at exactly 5:30, made the same bitter cup of black coffee, ate half a slice of toast, and folded the local paper without ever reading the headlines. He didn't care for news. The past was enough to carry. He didn't keep pictures on his walls or food in his fridge beyond the essentials. His world was quiet, his routines precise, his voice rarely heard beyond the clipped, "Good morning" to Mr. Franklin at the post office. No one in Harmony Springs knew where Thomas came from, only that one day he applied for a mail route and never missed a day since. He didn't go to church. He didn't visit the diner. He didn't attend town fairs or barbecues or holiday parades. Children called him the ghost mailman, and old ladies whispered theories, widowed veteran runaway priest, maybe even an ex-con who'd found peace in letters. But Thomas never confirmed or denied. He just walked and delivered and disappeared. Beneath the worn cap he always wore was a face lined with time and sorrow, with eyes that saw everything but refused to linger. When he passed the White House on Maple Street, he always slowed, but no one noticed. To him, every letter was a prayer he couldn't say out loud, every envelope a failed attempt at redemption. His hands, calloused and trembling slightly from age or memory, touched the mailbox like it was sacred. And then he moved on, back to silence, back to the trees, back to a life made of fragments built on routine and regret. Thomas Whitaker didn't speak much, but his whole life had become a conversation he never found the courage to finish. For 10 years without fail, Thomas Whitaker had walked the same path, carried the same canvas bag, and paused at the same white house with the old oak tree casting dappled shadows across the front porch. It didn't matter if the sun was high, or the roads were slick with ice if his knees ached, or the sky thundered above. He never missed a day. The house stood quietly on the corner of Maple Street, its shutters slightly crooked, and its mailbox painted red long ago, now chipped and faded with time. Most mailmen would have treated it like any other stop routine ordinary, but not Thomas. That house was different. He never rushed past it. Instead, he approached it with a reverence usually reserved for cemeteries or confessionals. Each morning at precisely 9:15, he'd slow down as he neared the familiar gate. His breathing changing almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the front step, though he never dared climb it. His fingers, always steady until then, would hesitate just slightly as he slid the envelopes into the box. Some days, it was just the usual Bill's store flyers, a birthday card from someone in Ohio. But once or twice a week, Thomas slipped in a letter of his own, making neatly written by hand, unsigned, addressed only to the woman in the White House with the red mailbox. Inside were fragments of things he'd never said, small compliments. Memories only he could know, a sentence about the smell of apples in autumn, or the sound of Sophie's laughter drifting through the trees. No one questioned the extra mail. Emma simply thought she had a kind, anonymous neighbor. But for Thomas, it was all he had left. That old oak tree had once shaded the woman he loved. That porch had once held a baby girl in a yellow blanket. That house held everything he'd lost. And so he delivered not just letters but penance daily in wordless, letting paper speak where he no longer could. That morning the sky hung low with soft gray clouds, and the light that filtered through the lace curtains of the White House on Maple Street was gentle and still. Sophie Lane, 10 years old and endlessly curious, sat cross-legged on the windowsill, her notebook open on her lap, pencil tapping against her chin. She had been watching the man in the navy jacket, the one who came every single day at the exact same time for what felt like forever. She didn't know his name. No one really did. But she called him the mail ghost in her head because he moved like someone carrying a secret. That morning, as he gently placed the envelopes into the mailbox, without so much as a glance toward the house, Sophie squinted, trying to catch his eyes through the glass. But as always, he never looked up. "Mom," she said, suddenly not turning her gaze away, "why doesn't the mailman ever look at us?" Emma Lane, standing at the sink rinsing dishes, paused. The question caught her off guard, not because she hadn't noticed the man's strange silence, but because she'd never let herself wonder too hard about it. She glanced out the window, following her daughter's eyes, and saw the same slouched shoulders, the same worn shoes, the same ritual of retreat. Maybe he's just shy. Emma offered, gently drying her hands on a towel, though something in her chest tugged something old and unsettled. "He always walks like he's thinking about something really important." Sophie added, her voice quiet now, almost reverent, like he's afraid of breaking it. Emma looked at her daughter, so observant, so sensitive, and smiled softly, brushing a curl behind her ear. "Some people carry heavy things, baby, and they're not always the kind you can see." But even as she said the words, Emma found herself watching the man's back as he disappeared down the sidewalk, wondering not for the first time why his silence felt so personal. It was the fall of 2005, and the leaves had just begun their descent in soft amber spirals across the hills of rural Kentucky, when Thomas Whitaker stood frozen on the porch of a modest brick house, 1,000 thoughts crashing behind his calm expression. Margaret Lane stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly over the slight curve of her belly, her voice trembling as she repeated the words he'd heard but refused to accept. "I'm pregnant, Thomas." The silence that followed felt louder than any scream, and for a moment time splintered. Thomas had always loved Margaret from the moment they met in high school, to every night he walked her home beneath a sky laced with stars. But now that love sat face to face with a force far older and colder, his family. His father, a retired military man with a temper like a fist, had made his views painfully clear. No children out of wedlock, No distractions from duty, no mistakes to taint the Whitaker name. And Margaret, beautiful, stubborn, radiant. Margaret had no idea how deep that pressure ran. "We can figure this out," she said softly, eyes wide with hope, reaching for his hand. But Thomas, 21 and terrified, stepped back. "I can't," he whispered, voice cracking. "My father, if he finds out, I don't have a choice." Her face crumpled, but she didn't cry. She stood tall, even as her heart broke, and said with quiet strength, "Then go. But don't come back unless you're ready to be more than a boy hiding behind a man's shadow." Thomas turned without another word, each footstep away from her echoing like a betrayal he would never outrun. He joined the army 2 weeks later, buried himself in duty, buried her in silence, and spent the next decade convincing himself it was better this way. But her eyes never left him. Not in memory, not in dreams, not in the aching space where love once lived and regret took root. After Thomas walked away, Margaret Lane stood in the empty doorway until the wind picked up and reminded her to breathe. She closed the door slowly, her hand lingering on the knob, as if letting go of it meant letting go of the life she thought they were building together. By the end of that week, she had packed what little she had into 3 boxes and a duffel bag, determined to disappear before the whispers started. She left her parents a note, short, respectful, final, and caught a bus headed south with no job lined up, no partner beside her, and a heartbeat growing inside her that became her only compass. She ended up in Harmony Springs, a town so quiet it almost felt imaginary, where the roads were cracked but kind and the people minded their own business, unless you needed help. She found work at a local diner, started renting a small white house on Willow Lane, and never once told a soul about the man who had walked away. When Emma was born, Margaret held her close in the dim hospital room and whispered promises into her daughter's hair, promises about safety, love, and never leaving. She worked double shifts when the diner was busy and picked up sewing jobs at night, rocking Emma in a second-hand bassinet with one foot, while threading needles with steady fingers. There were hard months when the heating bill stole her grocery money, and nights when Emma's fever made her heart stop. But Margaret never faltered. She never dated, never brought another man home, never even let herself cry about Thomas, not where Emma could hear. The past became something folded and tucked away in the back of a drawer. She told Emma that her father had died young, a man with soft eyes and a short life, and though guilt flickered behind the lie, she believed it was better than letting her daughter know she had been left. Harmony Springs became their world, and the White House under the oak tree became their home. And while Margaret rarely looked back, there were quiet nights when she sat alone on the porch watching the stars and wondering if Thomas ever looked up and thought of the child he'd never met. 3 years passed before Thomas Whitaker returned to the house where he had once shattered a future with a few cowardly words. By then, the uniform he wore had lost its shine, and the medals he carried felt like hollow decorations pinned to the chest of a man who had run from the only battle that ever truly mattered. He had seen war-watched men fall, written letters to mothers and wives with hands that trembled more from guilt than fear. But nothing haunted him like the memory of Margaret's face that day, standing tall, even as he broke her heart. When the bus pulled into the edge of Lexington, Thomas carried a single suitcase and a hope he didn't deserve. He rehearsed apologies in his head, imagined her opening the door with surprise and maybe forgiveness. But when he arrived at the familiar porch, the house was empty. The flower pots were gone. The windows shuttered, and the swing on the front tree creaked in the wind, like it too was mourning something lost. A neighbor across the street, a woman with silver hair and folded arms, watched him from her porch, and after a long pause walked over. "If you're looking for Margaret Lane, she moved out a while ago," she said flatly. "Left no forwarding address." Thomas's voice cracked as he asked if she had said anything, left anything. The woman handed him a small envelope with no stamp, just his name in Margaret's careful handwriting. Inside a single sheet. "Thomas, please don't come looking for us. You made your choice. Emma doesn't need a man who disappeared the moment life got hard. I've built a home without you. Let that be enough." There was no anger in the words, only finality. He stood there long after the sun dipped below the trees, the letter shaking in his hands, and for the first time in years, Thomas cried not for what he had lost, but for what he had never even tried to fight for. And in that moment, he understood forgiveness would not be given. It would have to be earned. Years later, that understanding would shape every silent step he took down the roads of Harmony Springs. Thomas didn't leave Harmony Springs after reading Margaret's letter. He could have. There was nothing holding him, nothing waiting for him in that quiet town, but the echo of a life he'd let slip through his hands. But instead of walking away again, he unpacked his small suitcase in a rented room above the bakery and applied for a job at the local post office. It was quiet work, structured the kind of routine that kept the mind busy and the heart just numb enough to endure. He didn't tell anyone why he came, and no one asked. Harmony Springs was a town that respected silence, where everyone had their own secrets folded neatly into their daily rhythms. He became the town's mail carrier without much notice. Just another man in uniform walking the same streets every morning with a leather satchel and unread grief tucked beneath his cap. But there was one house that Thomas approached with reverence, the white cottage on Willow Lane with the old oak tree in front and flower boxes that changed with the seasons. It was Emma's house. He knew it from the return address on Margaret's letter, confirmed it when he saw her name on envelopes, school flyers, and later college brochures. He never knocked, never looked into the windows, never lingered more than a second too long. Every morning at 7:03, like clockwork, he would place the mail gently into the box, adjust the flag, and walk away. Rain or shine holidays, or not for 10 years, he made that pilgrimage a silent act of penance carried out in plain sight. He watched her grow up through the details of her life printed on envelopes, the ballet recital photos, acceptance letters, handmade thank you notes from school. And though she never knew his name, Thomas felt close to her in those tiny, insignificant moments. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was the only way he knew how to stay without causing more pain. So he stayed year after year, his love folded into silence, his regret delivered one letter at a time. It started with a question over cereal. One quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of question a child asks when they've been watching the world a little more closely than usual. Sophie Lane, 10 years old and observant beyond her years, sat at the kitchen table in her faded pink pajamas, one leg tucked under her spoon, paused in midair. "Mama," she said without taking her eyes off the window, "why doesn't the mailman ever look at us?" Emma glanced up from the sink where she was rinsing dishes, her hands stopping mid-motion. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Sophie turned to her mother with a furrowed brow. "I mean, he always comes at the same time, always puts the letters in the box real careful, but he never looks at our house. Never waves, never says hi. Never even glances at me, even when I'm right there on the porch. It's like he's scared." Emma's hands trembled slightly under the stream of water. She forced a soft smile and said, "He's probably just shy, baby. Some people are like that." But Sophie wasn't convinced. Something about the man had always struck her as strange, not dangerous. Just distant, like he was carrying something heavy inside and didn't want anyone to see it. She had seen how he walked slower past their house than the others, how his hand lingered half a second longer on their mailbox, how he never made eye contact with anyone. To Sophie, it wasn't rudeness. It was sadness. And kids, especially kids who've grown up around quiet grown-ups, learn to recognize sadness without being told its name. That afternoon, she sat on the porch with a book and pretended to read, watching as the mailman approached. He didn't glance her way, didn't falter in his routine. But for the first time, Sophie noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way he placed the envelope in the box with almost too much care, like it mattered more than it should. Mama Sophie said again later that evening, "I think the mailman knows us. I think he's hiding something." Emma didn't respond. She just stared out the window toward the oak tree where 10 years of silence still lived. It happened on a Wednesday just past noon when the heat of the Kentucky sun pressed gently against the quiet town of Harmony Springs, and cicadas hummed in the tall grass like a lullaby for the lonely. Thomas Whitaker stepped off the gravel path as he had for 10 years, shoes crunching softly against the stones, his leather mailbag brushing his side with the familiar weight of ritual. But today, something was different. Sophie Lane was there again, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the porch swing, not pretending to read this time, but simply watching him quiet still with a gaze far too steady for a 10-year-old. As he reached the mailbox, fingers brushing the cool metal, he felt the pull of her stare like a thread stitched through his ribs. And then it happened. He looked up. For the first time in 10 years, Thomas Whitaker lifted his eyes and met the gaze of the little girl on the porch. Time didn't stop, it bent. The world didn't fall silent. It deepened. In that one glance, brief and trembling, an unspoken current passed between them. Not recognition in the usual sense, but something quieter, older, as if the blood in his veins paused to whisper a truth that words couldn't touch. Sophie didn't smile, didn't flinch. She simply held his eyes with a stillness that unnerved him, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mouth barely parting as if to speak, but choosing not to. Thomas's breath hitched. He blinked first. He dropped the envelope, just one today, and turned away too quickly, almost stumbling on the porch step, as if her eyes had made him forget how to walk. Behind him, Sophie finally whispered, too soft for him to hear, "I know you're not just a mailman." Emma watched from the kitchen window, hand frozen on the curtain, heart pounding in rhythm she hadn't let herself feel in a decade. Something had shifted, something that had waited 10 years beneath the oak tree, and the silence and the unopened truths of the past. On a humid Saturday morning in Harmony Springs, as clouds gathered over the ridgeline like secrets waiting to break, Sophie Lane walked purposefully through the creaky screen door of the post office with a question curled tightly inside her chest. She was clutching a small notebook and a pencil, wearing her yellow raincoat. Even though it hadn't started to drizzle yet, it made her feel braver. The post office, a one-room clapboard building tucked between the old barber shop and a shuttered antique store, smelled like paper dust and old stories. "Mr. Franklin," the postmaster looked up from behind the counter, his wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose as he smiled warmly at the little girl who had for weeks now watched the mailman like he was a character in a mystery novel. "Morning, Miss Sophie." He greeted, voice gravelly but kind. "What brings you in all serious like that?" Sophie hesitated only a second before stepping closer and leaning onto the wooden counter. "Mr. Franklin," she asked softly, "do you know the man who brings our mail, Mr. Whitaker?" The question landed with a surprising weight. Mr. Franklin adjusted his glasses, leaned back slightly, and gave her a look that danced somewhere between caution and nostalgia. "Why do you ask?" Sophie lowered her voice, eyes wide with an earnestness far beyond her years. "Because I think he's sad. And because he looked at me yesterday like he knew something I didn't." "Mr." Franklin exhaled slowly, tugging at his suspenders before stepping around the counter and leading her to a wooden bench near the wall of P.O. boxes. He sat down beside her, hands clasped, and stared out the dusty window. "Thomas Whitaker doesn't say much," he began, voice tinged with memory, "but he didn't used to be so quiet. Long time ago, back before you were born, he loved a girl real deep. Then one day he disappeared, and when he came back, well, he didn't talk about her anymore. Just asked me for the quietest job I had, and he's been carrying letters and regrets ever since." Sophie's pencil stilled against the page as she looked up, heart thudding. "Was her name Margaret Lane?" Mr. Franklin's lips pressed into a line. "That's not a name I hear often. But yes, child, that's the one, Mr." Franklin sat quietly for a long moment after Sophie asked her question, his eyes drifting toward the dust-speckled light filtering through the post office window, as if the answer might be floating in the air itself. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened into something closer to a whisper, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence for time, for loss, for the way pain shapes a man. "There's things this town remembers," he began, "and things it tries real hard to forget. Thomas Whitaker, well, he belongs to both." Sophie leaned in closer, her breath still, as Mr. Franklin continued. "He wasn't always like this. Back when he was young, Thomas had fire in him. Not loud fire, but the kind that burns steady, loyal, dependable. He loved Margaret Lane more than he loved himself, that much I know. But folks talk, and back then his family was the kind that didn't take kindly to complications. When Margaret got pregnant, Thomas vanished without a word. We all thought it was over. But 5 years later, he came back. Didn't say why. Didn't knock on her door. Just walked into my office and said, "Give me a job that doesn't need talking." Mr. Franklin's fingers tapped rhythmically on his knee. But there's something most people don't know. Something I've never told anyone, not even Thomas. The day he returned, he was different. Older, yes, but also broken. You see, before he came back to Harmony Springs, he'd gone to California. And there some say he tried to start over, got engaged, planned a new life. But then an accident, a car wreck, lost everything. Fiancée died. He walked away without a scratch, but something in him never came back. Sophie's eyes widened, her pencil forgotten on her lap. You mean, he came back because he lost someone else too? Mr. Franklin nodded slowly, voice hushed. Thomas has been carrying grief from 2 lives, child. One he left and one he couldn't save. That's why he walks the same route every day. That's why he never knocks. Because every letter is a prayer he's too scared to say out loud. Emma was folding laundry at the edge of the living room when she caught a glimpse of Sophie at the kitchen table, hunched over a large sheet of drawing paper with a pencil gripped tightly in her hand, her tongue pressed into the corner of her mouth the way it always was when she was completely absorbed. At first, Emma smiled softly, assuming her daughter was sketching another of her fanciful animal worlds, or perhaps the towering oak tree outside that Sophie loved to imagine was magical. But as she passed by arms full of clean towels, her eyes drifted toward the paper, and she stopped cold. There, in striking pencil strokes far too emotional for a 10-year-old, was a man in a faded blue uniform with stooped shoulders, a satchel worn to threads, and eyes shaded beneath a cap that somehow radiated a profound, aching sadness. Behind him stood the silhouette of their white house and the old oak tree. Emma set the towels down carefully and walked closer, her voice gentle but curious. "Sweetheart." "Who is that?" Sophie didn't look up right away. She shaded the lines beneath the man's eyes, then finally glanced at her mother. "It's the mailman," she said simply. "The sad one who never looks at us." Emma swallowed, surprised by the depth of observation and emotion her daughter had captured. "Why is he sad, do you think?" Sophie shrugged. But there was a softness in her voice, a quiet empathy that startled Emma. "I don't know. But he walks like someone who misses something. Or someone. I think maybe he lost his smile a long time ago." Emma crouched down beside her, heart tightening in ways she couldn't quite explain. The image was more than a drawing. It was a portrait of grief, of presence without connection, of a man who haunted the edges of their lives, like a ghost still waiting for forgiveness. Emma stared at the face on the page and whispered almost to herself, "You see things most people don't." Sophie looked at her and nodded. Maybe he just needs someone to see him back. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed and the house had settled into its usual hush, Emma sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the drawing of the mailman that Sophie had left out now, partially smudged from where her daughter's hand had rested too long. The lines were too precise, too knowing, as if Sophie had unknowingly reached inside Emma's guarded heart and unearthed a memory she'd spent years burying. A part of her wanted to crumple the page, throw it in the trash, and dismiss it as childish imagination, but she couldn't. Because those sad eyes, that hunched posture, that silent ache, they were real, and she knew exactly who they belonged to. The next morning, as Sophie slid the drawing into her backpack, Emma tried to sound casual, but her voice came out sharper than she intended. "You should stop drawing that mailman," she said, not meeting Sophie's eyes. "He's just a man doing his job, nothing more." Sophie looked confused, maybe a little hurt. "But he looks lonely. He's not your concern." Emma snapped, then immediately regretted it. Sophie lowered her gaze, nodded quietly, and walked out the door without another word. Emma stood frozen, flooded with guilt, and a pain she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The truth was, the mailman had once been more than a shadow in their lives. He had been part of the life Emma never got to have. The life her mother had fought to preserve after Margaret Lane died. Emma had made a choice years ago to protect Sophie from the sorrow, the betrayal, the abandonment, to raise her without the shadow of a man who had walked away. But now, with every sketch, every innocent question, Sophie was getting closer to a truth Emma wasn't ready to share. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because some wounds, no matter how old, still bled when touched. For over a decade, the small red mailbox in front of the Lane house had stood like a quiet sentinel at the edge of the gravel driveway, slightly rusted at the corners, paint peeling from years of sun and Kentucky rain. Every morning without fail, Thomas Whitaker would walk the same route through Harmony Springs, his bag of letters slung across his shoulder boots, silent against the gravel, breath visible in winter, soaked through in summer, but always there. And every morning he would pause at the White House with the old oak tree and place the mail gently into the box, as if handling something sacred. He never knocked, never rang the bell, never looked toward the windows where laughter or silence might drift out. He simply placed the envelope and walked away, and for 10 years not a single letter had been retrieved. Inside the box they stacked like layers of time itself, sealed but unopened, unclaimed, unread. The ink faded, the paper curled at the edges, a silent testimony to a man's enduring penance and a woman's unyielding silence. It wasn't that Emma didn't know the letters were there. Of course she did. She saw the shape of his shoulders through the curtain each morning, that same slow walk, the same careful placement. But something inside her refused to reach out and open the lid, as if opening even one envelope might crack open the vault she'd built around her grief and bring down a flood she could no longer control. For Emma, the mailbox had become a symbol not of connection but of separation, a boundary, a wall built of paper, and Thomas, day after day, honored that wall, not because he wanted to, but because he felt he had no right to breach it. So the mailbox remained full, a museum of unsent forgiveness and unheard apologies, guarded by time and sorrow, untouched by the one person they were meant for. That afternoon, the sky over Harmony Springs turned a strange shade of pewter, heavy with the threat of summer rain. Emma stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the stack of unopened envelopes Sophie had secretly retrieved from the mailbox and laid out like fragile ghosts on the worn oak table. Dozens of them, some yellowed with age, some newer, all sealed in quiet desperation. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Rage, old and sharp, flared in her chest. She had spent 10 years locking the past away, burying it beneath work, motherhood, silence. And now these letters, uninvited, unspoken, unforgiven, were sitting in her home like trespassers. Without thinking, she grabbed one at random, stormed outside to the fire pit behind the house, and struck a match. Her hands were shaking as the flame caught the corner of the envelope. The dry paper hissed, curling in on itself, smoke rising in delicate tendrils. But just before it collapsed into ash, her eyes caught a faint name on the return address corner. It wasn't just anyone. It wasn't some anonymous hand delivering apologies from afar. It was his name, printed in small, neat handwriting, Thomas Whitaker. She froze. The air around her seemed to still. The name hit her like a blow to the chest, years of repressed fury, betrayal, and confusion colliding with the crushing realization that the man she'd taught herself to forget had been walking past her porch every day, that the letters weren't random, they were his. The man who left her, the man who vanished when she needed him most, the man Sophie would never know. And suddenly the silence of the past decade became deafening. The letter crumbled into ash at her feet, but the name burned itself into her memory like a scar. Emma stumbled backward, the world tilting the truth, igniting something far more dangerous than anger memory. That morning, Emma Lane stood frozen by the ashtray behind the house, the charred edges of the half-burned envelope still fluttering in her trembling hands. Smoke coiled upward in lazy spirals, but all she could see burned into her vision more vividly than flame was the name inked in careful slanted script near the corner of the envelope, Thomas Whitaker. Her chest clenched, as if a hand had reached through time and memory and squeezed her lungs tight. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. But it was. After all these years, after the silence, the absence, the aching void that had shaped every part of her being, the letters were from him. The man who had walked away before she was even born. The man her mother had refused to speak of in anything but passing phrases, sharp, closed-lipped final. Her heart thundered with a chaos of rage, confusion, and a longing so old it frightened her. The need for answers rose like bile in her throat. Without waiting to change out of her house shoes or fix her wind-blown hair, Emma marched down Main Street toward the post office, fists clenched, fury barely contained beneath the surface of her otherwise composed demeanor. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside the warmth of the room, doing nothing to thaw the ice in her bones. Behind the counter stood Mr. Franklin, hunched over paperwork glasses slipping down his nose. He looked up with a start, blinking as if seeing a ghost. "Emma," he said, his voice wary soft. "You all right, dear?" "You knew," she whispered, teeth gritted. "You knew, didn't you?" He hesitated, silence hanging heavy like a confession not yet spoken. "Knew what?" "That Thomas Whitaker is my father. The postman who's been coming to our house every day for 10 years. The one I never looked in the eye. That was him." "Wasn't it, Mr.?" Franklin sighed, took off his glasses, and for the first time in years, looked at her not as a child, not as a customer, but as someone owed the truth. "Yes," he said quietly. "He's your father. He never stopped watching over you, Emma. Just from the only distance your mother would allow." The moment Mr. Franklin spoke the truth aloud, something inside Emma splintered, not like glass clean and sharp, but like old wood under pressure cracking with the weight of years. Her breath caught her vision blurred, and before she could stop it, the past came rushing in thick and suffocating like a wave she hadn't known she was bracing against. The image of her mother Margaret flooded her mind. Always tired, always guarded, always shifting the conversation when Emma asked about her father. She had thought it was to protect her from pain, but now she saw it differently. It was to protect herself from remembering, from reopening a wound that had never healed, only scabbed over in bitterness. Emma remembered every unanswered question, every holiday with one chair conspicuously empty, every father-daughter dance she'd skipped pretending it didn't matter. It had mattered. She had buried it so deep she almost believed herself when she said she didn't care. But now, knowing he had been right there in the same town, on the same street, walking the same path to her mailbox every morning, it made something inside her scream. A scream without sound, but with all the force of years she would never get back. She clenched her fists so tightly her nails bit into her palms. Her throat burned. How dare he? How dare he walk away when she was nothing but a heartbeat in her mother's body? How dare he come back only to hide behind a postal uniform, stuffing words into a box he never had the courage to knock for? How dare he let her grow up thinking she was unwanted, fatherless, invisible when he'd been there all along? The rage was so large it barely fit inside her skin. But underneath it, woven like a scar through all that fury, was grief. For the years lost. For the embrace never given. For the word dad that had died in her mouth before it ever had the chance to live. It was late afternoon when Emma, her eyes still rimmed red from the storm that had ripped through her heart, found herself standing on the worn wooden steps of the little chapel at the edge of Harmony Springs, the same chapel where her mother had taken her every Sunday without fail. Reverend Cole, an old man with kind eyes and a voice like softened gravel, welcomed her in without a word, sensing that this visit wasn't about faith or ritual, but about something deeper, older, unfinished. As she sat in the third pew, her mother's favorite spot, he approached quietly and placed a small weathered envelope in her hands. "Your mother asked me to hold this," he said gently, his voice more whisper than breath. "She wrote it during her final days, but she never had the courage to give it to you." Emma stared at the envelope as if it were a living thing. Her name, Emma Lane, was written in the familiar cursive that had once signed report cards and birthday cards and grocery lists on the fridge. Her hands trembled. Reverend Cole explained that Margaret had come to him weeping one morning, clutching the letter with both hands. She had spoken of regrets too heavy to carry to the grave of love that had turned to fear and fear that had hardened into silence. She wanted you to know the truth, he said. She just didn't know how to face the pain that truth might cause you. The envelope had remained locked in the chapel's little wooden drawer ever since, nestled beneath old hymns and bulletins, waiting for the day Emma would come looking. And now here it was. The truth Margaret had never spoken. The apology she could never whisper. The explanation Emma had craved without knowing it. Her mother had tried in the only way she could at the end. And now, as the light from the stained glass cast soft blue and amber across her lap, Emma held her mother's final words in her hands and realized this story, her story, was far from over. Reverend Cole's voice dropped to a near whisper as he motioned toward the back of the chapel, past the altar, and through the small door that led to the narrow stairwell descending into the old church storage room. She made me promise to keep it safe. He said, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a ring of keys that jingled faintly like tiny ghosts. But I didn't put it in the drawer like I told her I would. I couldn't. I don't know why. Maybe part of me knew she wasn't done, that you weren't ready. Or maybe I was the one who wasn't ready to carry that much sorrow on a single piece of paper. Emma followed him, her footsteps, heavy heart pounding against her ribs like it wanted out. The air grew colder as they descended. Dust swirled in the shafts of light slicing through slatted basement windows, and the smell of old wood mildew and forgotten memories wrapped around her like a second skin. In the far corner of the storage room, behind stacks of unused hymnals and a rusted brass lamp, Reverend Cole pointed toward an old coat rack with only one thing hanging on it, a faded gray wool coat clearly untouched for years. "It's still there," he murmured, "inside the left pocket. I checked once years ago. I didn't open it. I couldn't." Emma stepped forward slowly, as if afraid it might vanish if she moved too quickly. Her fingers hovered over the fabric before gently slipping inside the pocket, her breath catching as they brushed against something thin and fragile. A folded envelope, edges yellowed and corners bent. She pulled it out and stared at it in silence. No name written on it. No date. Just the quiet weight of everything her mother had never said. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just ink and paper. This was a lifeline from the past, buried not in the ground, but in layers of silence, shame, and love, too complicated to speak aloud. Emma held it to her chest, and for a long moment no one said a word. Emma sat alone on the edge of the old pew in the church basement, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the letter that had waited in silence for more than a decade. The paper, soft and fragile with time, held her mother's handwriting, shaky, uneven, but unmistakably hers. She took a breath, then began to read. "My dearest Emma," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer beside you, and I'm so sorry for that. There are 1,000 things I wish I had said, and this letter is too small to hold them all. But I need you to know one truth that matters most. Your father, Thomas, he was not brave the way I had hoped. When I told him I was carrying you, he broke. He let fear and the weight of other people's voices drown out his own heart. But Emma, he didn't leave and forget us. He left, and then he came back." Emma's fingers tightened around the edges of the letter as her eyes raced across the words. "I didn't tell you because I was still angry, so angry, and hurt. But over the years I saw him, always the same man delivering letters down our street, never changing his route, always stopping at our house. Every day, no matter the weather. He never knocked, never said a word, but I saw the way his hands lingered on the mailbox, the way he stood still for a second too long. He stayed in Harmony Springs, Emma. All these years, he didn't run, he didn't rebuild a new life somewhere else. He just stayed. In silence, watching from the edges, loving you the only way he knew how, by being near even if he couldn't step inside. I was too proud to let him back in and too broken to forgive. But you are braver than I ever was. Don't let my pain become yours. If you can, if your heart allows, forgive him. He never stopped caring. He just never knew how to ask for another chance." By the time Emma reached the final line, He has always been there, just one door away. Her tears blurred the words beyond recognition, but the message had already landed deep inside her chest, shifting something that had been locked away for far too long. Emma felt the world collapse inward as the final words of her mother's letter echoed in her mind like a chime that would not stop ringing. He has always been there, just one door away. The paper slipped from her hands, fluttering gently to the dusty wooden floor of the old church basement, as if even it could no longer bear the weight of what it carried. Her breath caught in her chest, shallow and broken, and her knees buckled as she stumbled backward, sinking to the cold floorboards, as if the truth had physically struck her. For 10 years, she had lived with the certainty that her father had abandoned her, had walked away without a second thought, had chosen silence and absence over love and responsibility. And now all at once that story, her story, was unraveling, thread by thread. Her fists clenched against her sides as anger surged up, first hot and wild. Where had he been during the school plays, the scraped knees, the lonely birthdays with one too many candles on a lopsided cake? What kind of man stood at a mailbox for a decade and never knocked? But the fury could not stand on its own. It crumbled almost instantly into grief deeper and sharper than anything she had felt before. She cried, not just for the little girl who had waited unknowingly, but for the man who had waited too, who had never once dared to cross the threshold of the life he had left behind. She thought of Sophie, her own daughter, and the idea of being separated from her for even a single day sent a cold blade through her chest. How had her father borne it for 10 years? Why hadn't he tried harder? Why hadn't her mother told her? Her sobs came without warning, raw and loud in the quiet church air, curling her body into itself like a question mark of pain. Everything she believed had been carved from a partial truth, and now she stood in the ruins of what was once a certainty, trembling undone, grieving not only for the father she had lost, but also for the years both of them had silently wasted. The wind had picked up by the time Emma reached the cemetery, carrying with it the faint scent of wild grass and something old like time itself sighing. Her steps were frantic, uneven as she crossed the narrow gravel path toward the familiar hill beneath the lone oak tree, her mother's resting place. She didn't know what she expected to find, or who, but the moment she saw him, the world stopped. There, sitting on the weathered bench beside Margaret Lane's gravestone, was the man whose absence had defined her life, and yet who had somehow always been near. Thomas Whitaker looked impossibly small, like time had folded him inward, like regret had worn him down piece by piece. He didn't look up as she approached, his gaze fixed on a single aged piece of paper in his hands. Its edges curled, the ink faded by years of being read and reread, guarded like something sacred. Emma's breath caught as she slowed, every memory flooding her at once. The way her mother would go quiet when someone knocked the unopened letters on the kitchen table, the deep, nameless ache that had always lived inside her. She stood frozen just a few feet away, unable to speak. Thomas finally looked up, and in his eyes she saw something she had never been prepared for, sorrow so deep it had become part of his posture, and love so unspoken it hurt to look at. "I used to come here every week," he said softly, voice rough like gravel. "It was the only place I felt close to her, to both of you." He held the letter out with trembling hands. It was Margaret's handwriting, the same letter Emma had read just hours ago. "She left this for you," he whispered, "but I couldn't bring myself to give it. I thought, maybe if I stayed, if I waited, someday you'd forgive me." Emma's heart twisted as she looked at him, not the stranger who had left, but the man who had never truly gone. The weight of 10 silent years lay between them, yet in that quiet moment, standing among stones and ghosts, something fragile and human reached across the distance. Emma stood frozen, staring at the man whose name she had once learned to bury under silence, resentment, and unanswered questions. Her voice cracked before she could even feel it rising, but the word cut through the cemetery air like a blade. Why, Thomas blinked slowly, as if the word had struck a nerve buried too deep for language. He looked at her then, not as the grown woman she had become, but as the child he had left behind, the infant whose face haunted him every morning. He slid envelopes into her mailbox without daring to knock. "Why didn't you stay when it mattered?" She pressed louder this time, years of pain surfacing without permission. "Why did you leave her? Leave me?" Her voice trembled, but there was steel underneath, forged from birthdays, missed school plays unattended from every night. Her mother sat at the kitchen table pretending she wasn't waiting for someone who never came. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it as if all the rehearsed explanations had evaporated. "I was afraid," he finally said, the words gravelly broken. "Not of you, of myself, of the man I let my family shape me into. I walked away because I thought I didn't deserve to stay." Emma's eyes burned. "So you punished us for your cowardice. You mailed letters instead of knocking. You think a decade of quiet penance makes up for a lifetime of absence?" He winced but didn't argue. "I never expected forgiveness," he whispered. "I just wanted to be near enough to hope for it." Emma's heart thrashed against her ribs, torn between fury and the undeniable ache in his voice. "Do you know what it's like," she said slowly, "to grow up with questions only?" Silence answered. Thomas looked down, ashamed. Every day, he said, voice nearly inaudible. "But I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to show up without ruining what little you had left." Emma stepped back, breath-catching. She had imagined this confrontation 1,000 ways, none like this. No shouting, no grand defense. Just a man hollowed by regret, answering the hardest question with a truth that hurt more than the lie ever could. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed in around the bones and stayed long after footsteps faded. Emma stood beside her mother's grave, the stone worn smooth from time and rain, her fingers trailing gently over the carved name as if trying to memorize the curves for the 1,000th time. Behind her, Thomas remained at a respectful distance, his presence not intruding but simply existing, like the soft rustle of leaves overhead or the warm breath of wind against skin. Neither of them spoke. There were no rehearsed apologies left to say no accusations that hadn't already lived in silence for years. The weight between them was not anger anymore. It was the ache of time lost and the fragile thread of something unnamed stretching quietly between them. Emma sat down on the small bench near the headstone, her shoulders drawn and her eyes fixed not on Thomas, but on a small bouquet of wildflowers she now cradled in her hands. He approached slowly, carefully, and without a word knelt beside the grave, taking out an envelope aged yellowed soft at the edges, and placed it beneath the flowers. His hand lingered a moment too long before withdrawing. Still no words, just a man and a woman, and the space where a family used to be, mourning what had been broken and what might still be mended. Thomas did not look at her directly, but he didn't need to. She felt his remorse in the way he moved, in the stiffness of his breath, in the way he never once tried to make the moment about himself. Emma didn't cry. Not this time. She just watched as he lowered his head and sat beside her, not close enough to touch, but near enough to be felt. And that, for now, was enough. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the earth, and the wind carried no voices, just the rustle of leaves and the memory of things not said. Still something softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the smallest hint of stillness of space being made of a presence that no longer tried to hide. Thomas had never been a man known for his tears. Not when Margaret left, not when he saw Emma's tiny shoes in the corner of that empty nursery one final time, not even when the years piled on like dust over a house no one visited anymore. But now, sitting beside his daughter at the grave of the woman he had once loved and lost in equal measure, something in him cracked, not with noise, but with the unbearable quiet of release. At first it was barely noticeable, a subtle tremble in his hands, a tightening in his throat as he tried to swallow the ache, the kind that lives just beneath memory and shame. But then, without warning, his shoulders hitched, and the tears came not violently, not theatrically, but with the raw honesty of a man who had carried grief like a silent companion for too long. He turned slightly away from Emma, as if ashamed of being seen this way, but it was no use. No. His hand covered his face, his other gripping the bench as if to steady himself against the tide of feeling he no longer had the strength to hold back. And still he said nothing. The sobs were soft, almost reluctant, as if the tears had waited years for permission to fall and now didn't know how to stop. Emma didn't speak. She didn't touch him. She simply let it happen. Because some things could not be rushed, especially a man breaking open for the first time. It wasn't just sorrow for Margaret, though she hovered around them like a prayer unsaid. It was for the birthdays, missed the letters, unread the thousands of steps he'd taken past a door he never had the courage to knock on. Every unspoken apology, every year he chose silence over bravery, every sunrise spent watching from a distance, it all flowed out now one tear at a time until he wasn't Thomas Whitaker, the man who had once walked away, but just a father mourning the time he'd never get back. And in that quiet collapse, the smallest seed of healing was planted. Emma's voice was quiet, not from softness, but from the weight of everything it carried. She sat beside Thomas, her fingers tracing the edge of the bench, absent-mindedly eyes locked on the small gravestone ahead, as if it still held breath and could hear what she needed to say. She waited, you know? She began, her tone steady, but laced with something deeper hurt, wrapped in memory. Every night for the first few years, she kept the porch light on. She made tea for two, left the door unlocked, just in case. I was too young to understand back then, but I remember the way she'd freeze when she heard footsteps on the road. Sometimes she'd go to the window and pull the curtain back so quickly you'd think she was expecting a miracle. Her breath caught for a second, but she didn't stop. And then the letters started coming. Same handwriting, same routine. Always in the box by 7. But you never knocked. You never asked if she'd read them. You never once looked her in the eye. She turned to look at him, then not in anger, but with the unrelenting clarity of truth that had taken years to form. She kept every single one, tied them with string and hid them in the back of the cupboard behind the tins we never used. But she never opened them. Not one. Because they weren't enough. They were words without presence. Regret without bravery. Her voice trembled slightly as she delivered the final blow, not out of cruelty, but because it needed to be said. Mom always waited for you to knock on the door, but you never did. You just left letters. And after a while, it was like watching someone try to forgive a ghost. Like you were sending apologies into a void, hoping they'd land somewhere. But forgiveness needs a face, needs a voice. And what you left behind was like an apology, with no one to receive it. She didn't cry. The tears had already been shed years ago. Now there was only the quiet ache of knowing some doors were left closed for so long they stopped expecting to be opened. Behind them, unnoticed at first, the soft crunch of gravel betrayed Sophie's quiet arrival. She had followed the path from the house to the cemetery, like she had so many times before, but today was different. Today she had questions she didn't need answered in words. She stopped a few feet away, clutching a small sketch pad against her chest, her eyes flickering between her mother and the man she now knew was her grandfather. Neither adult saw her. At first, Thomas was still staring at the gravestone, his body hunched forward in a grief that had waited too long to be seen, while Emma's face was turned away, lost in memories too jagged to touch. But Sophie didn't need to interrupt. She didn't need to speak. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, the same calm steadiness she inherited from a bloodline that had rarely shown love out loud, guiding her movements. She came to stand beside Thomas, looked at his weathered, trembling hands resting on his knees, and without a word gently reached out and slipped her small fingers into his. His hand flinched slightly at first, perhaps from surprise or shame or disbelief, but then it closed around hers, uncertain but willing. Emma looked over, startled at first, then softened the tightness in her chest, loosening just enough to let breath come through. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The silence between the three of them wasn't empty. It was full of years lost of love, never voiced, of forgiveness not yet formed but no longer impossible. 3 generations scarred by distance and silence, now bound by a single fragile moment of connection. The little girl's hand in the old man's palm was a bridge spanning decades of hurt, with a gesture that asked no questions and offered no judgment, only presence. For the first time in a very long time, Thomas felt like he belonged somewhere, not through letters left behind or memories held at a distance, but through touch, through stillness, through being chosen in the quiet. The morning Thomas turned in his resignation, the post office looked no different than it had for the past decade, the same flickering light above the sorting room, the same creaky floorboard near the front counter, the same quiet hum of routine that had become the rhythm of his exile. He arrived early as always, long before the doors opened to the public, and placed his worn leather satchel, faded at the edges, familiar as breath, gently on the counter. Mr. Franklin was already there, hunched over paperwork, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. He looked up with mild surprise when Thomas walked in without his usual thermos of black coffee, without the slow, deliberate steps that came from knowing there was always another letter to deliver. This morning, Thomas moved with the quiet resolve of someone who had finally laid down a burden he had carried for too long. He didn't offer a speech, didn't explain or reminisce. He simply placed an envelope on the desk, his name neatly typed in the corner, and gave Mr. Franklin a small nod. For a moment, the older man hesitated, then picked it up, his eyes scanning the letter that confirmed what he already sensed. "You sure?" he asked, voice rough with something unspoken. Thomas only nodded again, his gaze drifting to the window where a faint light broke through the gray clouds. It had taken him 10 years to find the courage to stop walking the same silent path, to step beyond the safety of routine and grief disguised as duty. There were no goodbyes to the others, no farewell lunch, no ceremonial handing over of keys. Just Thomas folding his coat over one arm, picking up the satchel that had long been a shield as much as a tool, and walking out the door not as a man fleeing the past, but as someone finally ready to meet the present. The bells above the post office door jingled one last time behind him. He didn't look back. There were no more letters to deliver, not to a house that had finally opened. Not to a girl who already knew him, not to a daughter who had finally seen him as he was late broken, but still there. Emma opened the cafe on a Thursday morning, so quiet that even the birds seemed to pause their song in respect. The sign above the door was simple, hand-painted in faded gold letters: "The Postman's Bench." Locals passing by slowed their steps, not because of the aroma of fresh-baked bread or the gentle steam curling from ceramic mugs, but because of the name it whispered of something personal, something familiar, yet newly reimagined. The bench itself stood just outside the entrance, restored from the one Thomas used to sit on while sorting the last of his deliveries. She had found it behind the old post office, worn and forgotten, its wood splintered and paint peeled by years of rain and silence. But Emma had sanded it down herself, brushing each groove with quiet reverence, repainting it the color of twilight just before dawn. A hue that reminded her of the mornings when she'd watch Sophie wait by the mailbox for letters no one would read. The cafe inside was warm and inviting, filled with little details that held stories beneath their surfaces, a stack of yellowed envelopes under glass near the counter, a mural of birds carrying letters through the sky, painted by Sophie, and a menu handwritten in calligraphy that mirrored her mother's delicate script. Locals came at first out of curiosity, then out of something deeper, a pull toward the place that seemed to offer not just coffee but a kind of quiet reckoning. People sat on the bench with to-go cups and memories. Some wrote postcards, others just sat in silence looking toward the hills. Emma never explained the name. She didn't have to. Those who had lived in the town long enough remembered the man who walked its paths with bowed shoulders and pockets full of unsent apologies. Naming the cafe. The Postman's Bench wasn't about the past. It was about acknowledgement, presence, and a kind of healing that brewed slowly like the perfect cup. It was a place where people paused not to escape their stories, but to finally sit with them. Thomas sat by the window of his small room, the evening light pouring in with the soft amber hush of closure. His hands, once accustomed to folding letters and slipping them through mail slots unseen, now trembled slightly as he unfolded a single page, one he had rewritten more times than he could count. The ink had dried, but the emotion within each stroke remained wet, raw, unresolved. He had spent weeks trying to craft the right words for Sophie, and every draft felt either too distant or too desperate. But this one at last felt like truth. He read it aloud quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid the words might collapse under their own weight. Dear Sophie, there are no letters that can undo silence, no stamps that can deliver what was lost. I never held you in my arms, never watched you grow, never sat beside you when you were sick or scared or simply needed someone to be there. That is my greatest sorrow. And though I was nearby, I never knocked. I thought I was protecting you from me from the past, from truths too heavy for a child to carry. But I see now that silence was its own kind of weight. You didn't need protection. You needed presence. And I wasn't brave enough to give you that. So this is not a letter asking for forgiveness. It is a letter promising presence. If one day you feel ready, if ever you find a place in your heart not for erasing but for beginning, I will be here. Not to explain. Not to be redeemed. Just to be with you. Quietly, fully as your grandfather. With all my heart, Thomas. He exhaled slowly and placed the letter in a simple wooden frame, the kind one might use for a child's drawing or a family photo. Something precious. And at the bottom, in handwriting more honest than polished, he added just one line beneath the signature. When you're ready to forgive, I'll be here. He set the frame on a small shelf in the cafe beside the bench, and a jar of paper birds Sophie had once folded, waiting for the day she might walk by and read it. Under the wide canopy of the old oak tree, the town still wrapped in the hush of early dawn, 3 figures sat quietly on the weathered stone bench, their silhouettes brushed in pale amber light as the first strands of sunrise crept across the horizon. Emma sat in the middle, her hands resting gently on her lap, eyes softened by a stillness that was no longer bitter, but earned. On her left, Sophie leaned her head lightly against her mother's shoulder, her sketchbook closed for once, resting beside her feet, the pages inside filled with fragments of the journey they had taken: skies and shadows, postmen and doorsteps, mothers and missing. And to Emma's right, Thomas sat without a letter in his hand for the first time in decades, nothing to deliver except presence. He didn't speak, didn't try to make the moment into something neat or redemptive. He just stayed breathing in the quiet, the way the air shimmered as the sun crested the hills and poured gold across the town below. For a long time, none of them said a word. It wasn't necessary. The bench beneath the oak had become their confessional, their chapel, their starting place. Sophie's fingers reached once toward her grandfather's hand, not tightly, not performative, just enough to say, "I see you." He responded in kind, his palm warm, calloused, unshaking. Emma, eyes glistening, but calm, exhaled a long-held breath. She didn't know she'd been keeping since childhood. There were no grand speeches, no apologies left to be exchanged, only the knowledge that this was the first sunrise they had shared as 3. The tree above them rustled gently as if bearing witness, and somewhere in the distance a bird began to sing. Beneath the oak, beside the bench, in the silence between generations, forgiveness was not spoken, but lived, and the sun kept rising. Sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from words, but from staying. This story reminds us that showing up, truly being present, even after years of absence, can open the door to forgiveness that once felt impossible. Thomas never rang the doorbell, never knocked, because shame kept him silent. Emma built a life over a wound she never dared touch. Sophie grew up watching her mother carry a quiet grief. And yet by the end, under the oak tree, 3 generations sat side by side, not because everything was fixed, but because someone finally stayed. In real life, many of us wait too long to reach out. We think it's too late to say sorry, too awkward to show up, or too complicated to explain. But presence doesn't require perfect timing. It requires courage. Maybe there's someone in your life who left, or someone you left. Maybe you're waiting for a letter that never came, or dreading a conversation that feels too heavy to begin. Let this story be your sign. Reach out. Even if you don't have the perfect words, even if all you can offer is a moment of silence on a bench. The truth is, most people don't need a flawless apology. They need to know you cared enough to come back. And if you've been the one holding the door shut out of pain, consider cracking it open. Sometimes the people we thought had disappeared were just afraid to knock. If this story moved, you share in the comments below. Have you ever reconnected with someone after a long silence? What would you say if you could? Don't forget to save this video so you can come back to it later. Subscribe for more stories like this, and share it with someone who might need a little reminder. It's never too late to come home.